I'm happy to present Dagmawi Yimer, and we're very glad that you could come here. You grew up in Addis Ababa, but you left the country because of unrest, where hundreds of people were killed and put to jail. And 12 years ago, you came to Italy via Lampedusa. And actually, shortly after you came there, you were one of the initiators of Migrant Memory Archive, Archivio della Memoria Migrante, which is still going on. And but you have also authored alone, but together with sometimes also co-authored several films, The Desert and the Sea, Like a Man on Earth, Dear Italy, and Nothing But the Sea. So it is impressive what you have done the last decade, and we are very much looking forward to hear about your work. So thank you once again, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Uno, sì, Italian. Thank you, Erling. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm supposed to speak an African English with an Italian accent, so it would be a lot strange. My name is Dagmawi Yimer, and what I do as a profession was not is fully related for what I have lived through, which is the immigration, or my purpose of going away from my country, Ethiopia, had become my profession. It was not intended for me. Well, it was not a plan for me talking or being in this profession, because when I went away from Ethiopia, I used to study law as a second-year student, and after having left Ethiopia, and especially after the longer and difficult experience which is in between from the departure to the arrival, which is Italy, have changed most of the people who went through that journey, the Libyan prisons and suffering, and also the crossing, because in the meantime people who went through with you from home have remained in the desert and in the sea, and arriving in Italy was grateful, but at the same time also shameful for one who arrives in that kind of way, in such kind of humiliating way, without a shoes, thirsty, hungry, and it wasn't what I meant about myself when I was a kid, or when I was just 1 year before I left. I didn't imagine myself to find myself in such a condition. So those are moments where everything that you find, that you cross, can be an opportunity. Italy was at that time, because many things have changed, and all the things that I am trying to introduce, to talk about, is referring to Italy. And I think Italy is also important for the rest of Europe to be followed, because many things are happening and badly changing the situation of of migrant situation in Italy. And when I arrived in Italy, by the way, I would like to thank Elyas that he mentioned some of my thoughts about whose stories are we talking about? Who is the owner of those stories? These are good questions and are also the demands that I make to myself when I talk about migrant stories and myself also. And I always prefer bringing my experience so that, or my story, and then going and talking about other people's story. What I have found in Italy is that the challenge of the language, and fortunately I found a small Italian school for refugees where I started. I went to learn Italian language, but there was an occasion where they offered us a video workshop, and I found myself holding a video camera, and I defined myself a filmmaker by accident. It was not my dream, it was not, but it became some sort of vocation, some sort of saying that I am existing and we are existing. And the image was the best way to bring our stories to the Italian society. This is what I thought at the beginning, but then I understood that the image by themselves are not enough, and so that I should learn the Italian language in order to bring all these film or stories to the public. As a migrant engaged in filmmaking, I especially interrogate myself, whose role I'm exactly supposed to assume once I have finalized the documentary, and if I am the owner of those stories, the holder of the copyright, am I the seller or the medium of those stories? What external power influence what I produce and to whom I am producing these stories? These are questions that, as a migrant and as a filmmaker, I pose to myself, because I had an experience in 2014. I don't know how many of you remember the shipwreck in Lampedusa, near Lampedusa, 3 October. And a group of volunteers have formed a committee, and they called themselves Comitato di 3 Ottobre. And they wanted to identify the bodies and send the bodies to their own to the families. Most of them are Eritreans and Ethiopian refugees. And they asked me if I am willing to do a film on it on that day. I already gave up doing films on emergency stuff, because I understood after the second film that whatever pain we tell, it's not enough telling the pain of we remain the experts of our disgrace, but not other thing. And we remain trapped in this painful life, and nobody can understand that there was a normal life before and a future that we long to reach. So most of the time we are closed in a parenthesis, which is our pain and our sufferings. And this kind of representation of the migrant dehumanize the person. Any European public or spectator cannot find himself in those stories that we tell, because we don't tell him about our childhood wishes, what kind of books we used to read, and what kind of music that we used to hear. So we are extremely far from his imagination that our life was normal before we are living that painful moment, or when we are giving a testimony about that specific. And I didn't want to remain on that area. I wanted to go away from the pain and talk about the future, the wish of a migrant, and also the past life of the migrant. And remain the present is has been already talked a lot, and still it is an argument that doesn't give us time to reflect that we are talking about human beings. I don't know if you are following me. So they asked me to do a film, and you can imagine, but that time I was already fed up of this. Some described it as the pornography of pain, and I say yes, but I was also afraid of. I was not convinced because of Lampedusa at a certain point, at that moment, became a nourishing element both for the media and for the politicians' debate. But I accepted the proposal of directing and filming the flash mob in Lampedusa. And I was looking for 368 living beings, human beings, to participate, and it was impossible to get them. Imagine what it means finding 368 dead bodies in Lampedusa at that shipwreck. And my acceptance came when I have received all the names of the victims. And that is when I decided, yes, I can do that film, or this film, because at least I have their names. And I used all the names, the local names, translated in Italian and in English, because we have two versions in Italian, the meaning of every name, by naming 668 people. And it's not too long, but the perception of watching a 17 minutes video, it seems like you have to count all of the names. There is nothing else but staying fixed on your chair and counting those names. The committee members, some of them, not all of them, wanted me to reduce the minutes of that video, and I refused because I didn't want to do a spot about immigration. A lot of sacred stories had been reduced to a commercial spot, and this is the problem of the market. It asks us, or the way of life, or the way of communication is leading us to follow not the right way to tell the stories, but the right way to fit the exigence of the frenetic life. So I refused to. That was meant to be cutting from 368 names, some of them. some of them and reduce it in 6 minutes. And it was not acceptable because it was very, it doesn't have any sense translating and talking about some names and leaving out those names. For the first time since any shipwreck, for the first time we found all the survivors' name. Why don't we use it? This is one of the examples that, and mostly I would love to one of the things or the production that we do or that I do, maybe Erling has talked about Archivio delle Memorie Migranti, which is the archive of migrant memory. Is based in Rome, and one of the targets where our production, film production, are students. For 10 years or 8 years, I've been going around at schools and meet a lot of school students who listen to my testimony, my stories. What is happening is, since we are concentrated in answering the emergency and studying the emergency, we don't give time to invest or to invest to the future generation. Those kids that I used to meet 10 years ago, now they are 26 years, 24 years, and they are working in a working situation, and they can vote. So since the European situation is getting bad, I think the place where we can really bring artistic or whatever kind of studies are schools, not to convince but to give alternative stories to the students. So that is what Archivio delle Memorie Migranti is trying to do in Italy, and it is important to know as a filmmaker where you want to bring your job, your final product, and what is the purpose. Yes, winning a festival is important, but who goes and see your films at the festival are selected people. Wherever you prepare or organize a filming or a screening of your product, you go and meet not the normal or the common Italian public, but those who are at least sensible to the issue. So we have to know also where to address as a filmmaker. That is my direction, and I think it's never a wasted time working with kids. So regarding one of the things that I would like to say is that I'll go back to the saturation of immigrant issues on artistic representation of stories, because many filmic production have been made, and one of my friend, a director, told me one day that he won't do any more films on immigration, because he says and he believes that has all film regarding immigration, everything has saturated. And I don't believe, absolutely not, that migration as a subject has saturated, because what it saturates by the time, what is saturated is the catastrophic representation of the immigration phenomenon, and the way and the approach that we what we as directors, I mean, have chosen to narrate, and what is along those stories and faces are not still where they are waiting to be told, because one of the problem is the language, of course. No, when we are mostly asked to tell our stories, apart from most of the people who wants to hear what happened when I told you the parenthesis, what happened, how did you go, how did you manage to survive in those places, and how is the procedure. These are the questions that mostly being asked, and but since the language barrier influence on what we have few words to explain our life, and it needs time to people elaborate one's life experience, but also needs the language, the capacity to tell that story. So it takes time. It's not that all the migrants who came in Italy, I'm talking about Italy, have been interrogated or asked, and what lacks is the words of sentiments also. Maybe we can talk about, and mostly we are forced to talk about what we lived through, but not what we think about. What we think about is already cancelled, because we are not supposed to think, but we are supposed to tell what we live. And this is what we, as a migrant, and what I see is a tremendous thing, because whenever there is a meeting on immigration, the migrant doesn't exist. It's like talking about women's violence without any women in the room. This is what is for me the inclusion of the migrant, whether on the production of those filmic production or documentaries, and the method that a director uses to produce his own film, and also how at the end of the production the film, where does it go, and who is the owner of those stories. Not the director, not only the migrant. So bringing one's story, the film can be helpful for the migrant to go and meet the public, and not the director itself. So it's always an excuse. A film should be an excuse to bring stories and people, and meeting the public that we need. So I have time, yeah. Here, many times, as regard the immigration phenomenon and the role of image in building and supporting strategies of perception and forms of representation in society, documentary cinema should fight them to maintain its own sacredness. The sacredness of those stories, what I was talking about, is documentaries have the privilege to maintain those sacredness, by which I mean it's a privileged voice, because documentaries are to break through cliché, its ability to propose a different perspective on migrant stories. It's not that I am saying I would like to make it clear that since I am the migrant, I shouldn't be the only one who tells the story of the migrant. This is not the case. This is not what I think. But the plurality of the approach is much important to understand what are we talking about, because there is someone who sees coming the other one, and the other one is the migrant is seeing the people. So there is an exchange of experience. I cannot say that our story, there is always a point of view of the migrant towards himself, but also the society in which he finds himself, and how that society is changing him. And what I am saying is there is a lack of plurality, because we are constructing in this period, in this moment, while we are telling the so-called migrant stories, we are already doing the archive of the future. And this archive of the future should include also the point of view of the migrants, which is beyond the agony, the pain, and the sufferance that we went along. Okay. I will say one last thing. Why I chose maybe to do cinema or to do documentaries. In Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, you know the colonial story of Italy and Ethiopia. And when there was the fascist occupation in Addis Ababa, there was a place, Addis was totally controlled, and the people from Addis could not accede in some places of Addis Ababa. It was strange to imagine it now. And when I was a kid, I used to pass through this place which is called the Satan Beit, which means house of Satana, or the devil's house. So I understand later, when I grew up, that place was nothing else than a cinema. A cinema because that place was once visited by the people of Addis, and they saw that a certain kind of light is going out from an instrument and projecting itself on a white drop, and on that white drop there are people moving. So at the end they say this could not be other than the work or the art of Satan or the devil. So I always think when I think about cinema in Italian and the way to communicate Italians is the best way to cinema is the best way to I'm using their own devilish way of expression and I found myself doing these things to Italians. So yeah, that's it. And if there are questions, I'm here to answer, whether regarding my personal experience, but also about the archivio. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Thank you so much, Dagmawi, for a very interesting and intriguing presentation. The powerful points you bring up about representation. Questions? A couple of them, maybe?
Others?
Just a really quick question. How about those names? How were they found?
There were survivals in that day. Among the 400 people who were on the boat, the people who survived, they knew every single, because most of them are Eritreans and some of them are Ethiopians, and there was this list of names given to a journalist who gave me these names, and that was surprising for me, and I was very happy that at the end, thanks to these people who had survived, they furnished all the names, because there was a pending or justice on some of the people who were alive, because the tricky thing is, among all the things, is the one who is responsible is always the one who is the captain.
Yes.
And many of them were denouncing the captain for having done that kind of error. So people who had survived, they furnished the names of the people who had died. And they are still working on the identification of everyone, because even though those names exist, the bodies are not well located with the right person.
And that movie is online, right?
Yeah, you can find it. Yeah, this is also, there
and it's called, what is it called?
Asmat, which is, Asmat Names is called. Asmat,
and it's
in Tigrinya, which is an Eritrean language, spoken in Eritrea, which means names.
And it's in Vimeo, right?
Vimeo, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Beautiful. Very interesting. And I was thinking, I mean, you talk about many topics I have been thinking about many times. And it's very important in my field of migration studies and social sciences. And I'm thinking more and more about the right to opacity. Not everything should be studied. Not everything should be documented. Not everything should be revealed. And this, what you talked about, is very much I liked, and I think we should do more and talk more about how we should resist, not only borders, but we should resist the scholars, we should resist journalists, we should resist filmmakers, and keep secrets, and the right to opacity, resistance against documentation. So, thank you.
So thank you so much. We'll have not a whole hour like we thought at the end for discussion across the presenters, but some time. So we will head to the next presenter, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dagmawi.
it somehow calls nicely to your opening with the Cinema Paradiso as well, and I guess we are going to see a film or an excerpt, I guess, a tiny bit. And I'm glad to introduce to you Antje Missbach, who is a senior research fellow and lecturer at the School of Social Sciences at Monash University in Melbourne. She holds a PhD from the Australian National University, Canberra, and a magister from Humboldt University in Berlin, Germany. Antje is interested in the politics of migration in Indonesia and the wider Asia-Pacific region, particularly the socio-legal dimensions of irregular migration, trafficking, human smuggling, and related transnational crimes in the Asia-Pacific region, transit migration, maritime security, social deviance, and marginalized forms of existence. She regularly writes opinion pieces for The Conversation, Inside Indonesia, and Jungle World. She is the author of a number of books, including Troubled Transit, Asylum Seekers Stuck in Indonesia, published in Singapore by ICS in 2015, and co-editor with Gemma Purdy of Linking People, Connections and Encounters Between Australians and Indonesians, published in Berlin by Regio Spectra in 2015. Please welcome Antje.
Okay, tusen tak. Let me thank the organizers. Okay, let me thank the organizers for the kind invitation, but also thank you for staying on. It's been a very interesting afternoon, and thanks for bearing for one more presentation before you finally get a chance to ask your questions. That's all right. Okay, so I'm going to tell you the story of the making of a documentary, which is called Respite, that I have been involved in. And maybe just as a background, so for the last 8 years I've been working on the subject of asylum seekers and refugees in Indonesia, and I've been particularly interested in what it means to be stuck, like for people if they can't go back from where they come from, but if they also cannot continue their journeys. Next to my academic writing, I try to engage as much as possible in raising awareness about injustices in regard to migration and the freedom of movement. I try to address political marginalizations and social exclusions. But lately, I have come to notice that just writing about things or talking about things might not be enough, and therefore I was very happy about the opportunity to make a documentary together with a couple of friends. So my role was pretty much doing a bit of the background research and organizing the funding. And I'm hoping to show, a tiny bit of the documentary today. Maybe just a bit background of what it's like to be a refugee in Indonesia. I suppose not too many people might be particularly familiar with this context. So the actual number of asylum seekers and refugees in Indonesia is not particularly large. There's only like around 40,000 people registered in Jakarta under the UNHCR. But Indonesia has a very crucial role as the so-called last stepping stone on the way to Australia. So even though in the neighboring countries like Malaysia and Thailand you have much larger numbers of refugees, but a lot of attention is on Indonesia, like the border protection is particularly thick in this place. So the people who are coming to Indonesia are from more than 40 different countries. The largest number is actually from Afghanistan and particularly the Hazara minority. So I mentioned before, I'm interested in the notion of stuckedness. So in Indonesia, we have seen pretty much the end of regular refugee resettlement, and that has very much to do with the global fatigue to resettle people. But on the other side, we have also seen an end or an interruption, at least, of irregular journeys by boat to Australia, and that's very much because of Australia's Operation Sovereign Borders, a militarized intervention that either forces asylum seeker boats back to Indonesia or takes the people and detains them in Manus and Nauru. Indonesia, in a way, is a rather unwilling host country yet. It has not signed the Refugee Convention, but on the other hand, a lot of people have been coming to Indonesia, and I'm thinking here, for example, also about the Vietnamese boat people that came in the 1970s, and Indonesia was hosting them as well. General, from my experience in the last 8 years, I find that not very much is known about Indonesia as a host country by Indonesians. So, for example, the word pengungsi, refugee, does not necessarily mean that it's a foreigner who comes to Indonesia in order to look for protection. Pengungsi is also a word which is used, for example, for people who have been displaced by tsunamis, volcano eruptions, and those kind of natural catastrophes. When Indonesians deal with foreigners, it's often not in the refugee context, but they think of the stranger as a tourist or an aid worker or a Western celebrity, not the needy stranger. That's kind of a new phenomenon. And what we have noticed in the last years, this lack of knowledge has provided a fertile ground for negative stereotypes to evolve quickly. The lack of knowledge about what it means to face this so-called global crisis of movement. So it's the negative stereotypes are increasing, and here I mean like refugees as bringers of bearers of disease, the threat of terrorism, the angst of invasion. So this is basically the starting point for us to create a more nuanced picture of those asylum-seeking refugees already living in Indonesia and often for extended periods of time, and start a conversation with Indonesians about the fact that they are hosting these people. So why make a documentary? I mean, there are of course existing documentaries. A number of Australians have come to Indonesia, have portrayed the life of refugees and the hardship. The main focus is often on individual stories, but we notice that Indonesia is often shown as this kind of tropical scenery, but there's very little engagement with the host country and the local host communities. So we wanted to show a bit more of those existing connections, but particularly in order to raise sympathy for the host, to acknowledge or give credit to what people have been doing despite being rather reluctant hosts. So I guess in these global debates that are taking place, there's a lot of focus on countries of origin and potential countries of destination, but not so much on a transit country. And Indonesia is often considered to be such a transit country, despite the fact that people live there for many years. And even though we talk about transit, it's often described as a sort of vacuum. And I find a need to fill this vacuum with stories and what happens in between the departure and the arrival, because it often takes much longer than assumed. So rather than only just concentrating on the challenges that refugee lives brings with it, we wanted to also bring in a little bit the perspective of the host and the host community. So Indonesia is not just a tropical scenery, it's a real country with rules, regulations, and specific requirements that shape very much the refugee lives. So the idea behind is to acknowledge Indonesia as a host country and the existing hospitality in a way to build good rapport. But we do this in order to make our main message a little bit more palatable to the Indonesians, because our main audience is actually Indonesians. And I was very grateful for the comment that you made about taking the time to invest into the future generations or the future voters. So we made this documentary specifically for high school students and university students. So usually when I think about this documentary, I don't think about having produced art. Really, it's more like trying to sneak in a political message to a kind of mainstream crowd. This is who we are reaching. So we're not trying to estrange or a certain message, but we try to make it as palatable or as familiar as possible to sell our story. So we appreciate the good examples of things that have happened in Indonesia over the last years, certain improvements of people, for example, being taken out of detention centers and being allowed to live in communities. We do show this, we acknowledge these positive developments, but of course we also have to show some critical things that are not working out so nicely in Indonesia. So we're not trying to sugarcoat the reality, but we start to give a more nuanced picture. However, when we were making this documentary, we found that striking a balance is actually a huge challenge. So you try to bring in Indonesians to show a friendly picture, but at the same time, you of course cannot prevent also having to address certain negative repercussions. Respite is one of two documentaries that I have been involved in. The other one is about a music project with Oromo rap singers, Indonesian musicians. But I'm going to tell you mostly more about Respite. First of all, a bit about the filmmaker Andrianus Mirdi, commonly just referred to as Ucu. So I have known Ucu for a long time, since we were both students in Berlin. We lost contact over the years, and it was pretty much coincident that that our paths crossed again. And we noticed that independent from each other, we had both developed this interest in refugees and transit migration. Once I met him again, I started to look at his previous works. He had made a short documentary about people smugglers in 2014, and then he also spent quite a bit of time in Germany and filming what was happening there from so-called outsider's perspective. And what I really liked about Ucu's approach in filmmaking was his tactfulness and his ability to pay attention to a lot of details, but also the capability to reflect on issues from multiple angles. So we basically decided, let's make a film together. And the treatment that we came up with was that we wanted to concentrate on two characters, Afghan teenagers, and portray their relationships with the local hosts, friends, but also the Indonesian authorities. The idea was to show mundane, everyday activities, but also integrate some interviews with them, and then some interviews sections with Indonesian friends. The first character, Özil, that's his nickname, is in a local soccer team, and he has an Indonesian girlfriend. And the other one, Yama, we chose because his Indonesian is really great, and he was very much involved in organizing a couple of refugee protests, and I will say more about it in a while. So the setting of the documentary is the city of Makassar. Again, a rather deliberate choice of not opting for Jakarta, the capital city that always has this kind of elitist connotation, but we wanted to have a city that maybe other people can relate to much easily. Just as a background of Makassar, there's about 2,000 refugees and asylum seekers living there. Most of them are not detained, but they live in shelters, and that made it for us a lot easier to actually approach them and spend time with them. And of course also to observe their interconnections with the locals. Okay, and now I'm hoping this is going to work out. I wanted to show you a little sequence.
Bagaimana arti kata menunggu untuk kamu atau perasaan kamu menunggu di Indonesia?
Menurut saya kalau menunggu di sini, kalau pemerintah Indonesia kasih kami izin untuk kerja, ya aktivitas di luar sama orang lokal, kami akan senang dengan senang hati kami akan tinggal di sini daripada kita pulang di negaraku, tinggal di sana. Kami lebih suka di sini. Rakyatnya bagus, orang-orang lokal di sini semua kayak saudara, kayak teman. Saya tidak pernah lihat ada yang bicara sama saya dengan cara kasar atau apa. Selalu semuanya baik, baik para pengungsi semuanya. Kami juga hormati dia, mereka juga hormati kami. Jadi Saya lebih suka kalau pemerintah Indonesia izinkan pengungsi kerja di Makassar, di Indonesia. Itu akan buat kami lebih nyaman, aman, dan agak ada harapan buat kehidupan.
Oops. The point that Yimer addresses here is pretty much that refugees in Indonesia are prevented from working, and that has caused a lot of trouble for them because there's not really much financial support for them. At the same time, not being allowed to make an income renders them really in a difficult space. In some cases, basically pushes them in some sort of like criminal existence. And yeah, this lack of working rights has become a big issue for asylum seekers and refugees at the moment in Indonesia. And so when we started making the documentary, we thought we had built good rapport with the people, but when we started filming, a number of anticipated challenges came up. And one of them was that despite the good reputation that Makassar had as a city that hosted refugees, almost like some kind of sanctuary city, was disrupted because a new head of immigration detention was appointed, and he was going basically gung-ho and destroying a lot of the good work that had been done in the past when it came to building solid networks with NGOs and local authorities. So this head of immigration basically started to introduce a lot of like stricter surveillance measures, curfews were introduced, and it made it for us really difficult to meet people during their everyday activities, but also people became a bit more uncomfortable at being involved in this documentary. In a way, the shelters that used to be this kind of open places where people could go and come as they wanted started to resemble more and more the detention centers where people had actually been released from. So getting access was difficult, but also like getting out for the two boys that we had chosen became a bit of a problem. So sometimes they would have to sneak out or climb over a fence just to help us with the documentary, because of course the time schedule was very tight and budget was running out quickly. But more drastically, probably just like in the week where we started the filming, refugees were organizing protests against these new surveillance measures. So they were holding demonstrations pretty much on a daily basis. And on the one hand, this was not something we had wanted to film, like we wanted to pay more attention to the everyday friendly relationships, the friendships that had been involved, but we could not completely ignore the protests that were taking place, particularly because Yimer was very much involved in holding these protests. Although the demonstrations remained peaceful, they continued steady over the next weeks and months. And unfortunately, we also saw that the media coverage, the local media coverage, was becoming less and less favorable of the refugees. And the whole thing was topped by a kind of smear campaign by the head of detention, who started to defame asylum seekers as pedophiles or as people who were stealing the wives of the policemen. Like a lot of strange rumors that were spread that often can find a rather fertile ground amongst like Indonesians. So that was definitely difficult for us. Also because some of the Indonesian friends of our refugee characters were less likely to talk in front of a camera. Anyway, so one way or another we managed to film the documentary. It's 30 minutes long, and we launched it in Jakarta in July 2018. And well, the initial media perceptions were quite positive. we have not had the chance yet to screen the film in Makassar, and that's very much because we think it's much better to wait for a little bit longer, because it's really important to us to not do any harm to the two boys that were interviewed. So it's probably going to be delayed to next year. And 2 weeks ago we found out that our documentary was chosen for a script writing program in Yogyakarta in December 2018 under the auspices of a French committee. And so we're kind of planning to go back to Makassar and develop the short documentary in a kind of like full length in the near future. And that of course also means having to find more funding and so on and so on. And I think if I still have like a tiny bit of time, I would like to show you the trailer, even though there's not time to watch the entire documentary, but at least you get an impression of what we came up with. Yes.
Any questions? If not, then maybe we can call all the speakers to come up to the front. And we will meet the questions, the other questions that you may have kept.
I think first of all, thank you, Antje, for the presentation, and thank you for staying. I know it's late and we've been running a bit late. I hope it's okay that we maybe spend like 15 minutes to discuss. We understand if you need to leave. So I was thinking, first of all, I mean, there are several things that cut across, I think, the presentations. Definitely the issue of time, and also the issue of labor, and also the kind of broader questions about representation, the aesthetic, political aspects of representation have been coming up. So one thing is, like, if you have reflections about each other's works. I was in a pause, for example, thinking about Khosravi's presentation, which I thought was really interesting in relation to the categories of time. But then there was like, but there also seemed to be presentations talking about, like, well, how can we think about time from the migrant's perspective? Because categories that Khosravi you presented are the kind of the dominant power who is, suppressing and producing certain time. So could we find new categories of time, for example? So I don't know if that's an entrance point. to some of you?
I just want to say something about the documentary. This is one of the aspects that I liked because, as I mentioned, to talk about outside the pain or the suffering, there is also the non-said, the things that mostly we don't see. As I saw on the trailer, there are many situations where where the film that I have to see is important to show at least the non-said. Mostly are love stories and jokes who can give humanity for the people. So this is a good point, and I have seen a lot of connection. I don't know how you chose the people, but I found myself with every person's work, and this is good. Maybe tomorrow we'll talk about it.
Yeah, it's my turn. No, I think I mean both in your presentation, I was thinking about how can we avoid this othering in our works, and it's something I recently refer many times to is Mohsen Hamid's this Pakistani American writer, his recent book Exit West, and he writes about migration, but he avoids writing about journey. And for journey part, he used magical doors. So going through magical door. So and in one interview he said, he was asked why using magical doors. He said, I want to avoid othering of migrants, and I don't want to write about journeys. I don't want to write about migration. And he wrote a story about love of two persons. So this is how that's very beautiful, beautiful example. Me as anthropologist think about how can I go this way? Yeah.
Would that then challenge the whole kind of migration studies? Would it be mobility studies, or what would that imply?
Of course, yeah. This is why I brought out. I wrote a very short text about this right to opacity, yeah, and how it's. This is very related to these magical doors, and how can we write about migration? How can we write about violence, injustices, victimhood, without reducing all these to victims, to pornography of suffering, to othering? You know how it's possible. It's important to write about all these issues. Of course, it's important to make film, to make art, but how can we do that without ending up in this reproducing the same image of the other? And it's very important question, and it's very challenging. Yeah, it's very politically and ethically, responsible for us as artists or a scholar or fiction writer, I think.
Can I just add one? I'm also just going to point out about the time that you mentioned. It was just so interesting to hear, and I felt like time was something that I myself as a refugee and also many other friends, we never thought that our time is valuable, really. We thought, like, even, for example, I remember one of our neighbors, he fell off from a building, and because he didn't have any insurance, of course, being an Afghan person, he could not have any type of insurance. But I felt like even the company and the other people who employed him, they were like very angry. They're saying like, oh, we had to stop our work because of you, maybe for a day or for a week. And even their family was kind of saying, oh, kind of showing that sympathy that, oh, sorry, we kind of wasting your time by our family members got killed in a way. And as you're saying, like how those times that you wait, I waited for a year, and just by going there and having the interview and just feeling that, oh, this person had to translate it so much, and just he must have so much important things to do, and have to read my case. And that was something very, very interesting, because almost, I think it might be the same for many refugees, especially. They feel like, oh, they kind of, their time is not valuable, you know. That was very, very interesting.
It struck me kind of how there seems to be a constant denial of allowing people to have imagination and thought. Many of you brought that up. And then the fight for time to imagine other times, other forms of times and other forms of spaces seems to be something that has been brought up by several of you, I think. So, which is quite interesting. I don't know if you want to comment about that. Okay, you had a question?
Yeah, I think it was just to say thank you very much for doing this in this building. And I think, for the past maybe 4 or 5 years I've been in the building and in Valan. And it's been really pleasure to hear some real issues. Like, I don't say the others are not really not real, and I think it's a time to really talk about this issue, which has been happening right now, you know, outside of probably this building or this country. And I had a quite few comment about, you know, the whole reflection about the talks today. And one thing I would like to start is I went as a refugee to UK, and I waited for my papers for 11 years, and after 11 years I received a letter that I should be deported back to home, which my identity was mixed with another person. And this was the time when I was doing my BA in the UK. So to make the journey short, after a real fight, I got my papers sorted, then I moved to Sweden. So I'm kind of in this idea of, you know, chasing my type of home. I live here now, and I did my MA with Rose here. But I would like to just say some comment about this idea of timing. And I think it's really an issue, like what you're saying, it's like talking about a disease that no one got that disease. It's like you bring the examples of talking about women's violence without having a woman in there. And I feel like that in some of the events that they are talking about the migration issue. And something that I realized by making art was the empowerment of creativity, how much creativity could give you when you are making, and how much of that disturbance of being away or the reflection that you had leaving home could be solved through making, writing poetry, or the writing or whatever. So that, I mean, in my case, my situation was something I didn't want to talk about with anyone. That was the most disturbing things for me to do. But then finding a way to draw, to film, to make art was something that gave me a lot of power and statement to say who I am. But I also, through my own situation, I'm talking about other bigger national, international issues, which is, which I think every immigrants should have that opportunity to talk. But going to the representation of immigration issues is really an important issue, and I think it should be in a way that, because the ideas of this idea of immigration is already, you have a tag on the subject, and somehow the representation gives you, this name of immigration sometimes give you an idea of what type of work you would see. Either it could be a documentation of an event, a demonstration, or a documentation of someone. And I think now is the time to find a new way of, like what you say, new way of dealing with this issue. Talk about it in a different way. And I don't have any question, but I just want to thank you again for doing this here. Thank you.
So I had two things. I think they're related. I was struck with the example of the Conchi stories, that there was an interesting example of someone stealing her time back. So Shahram brought up the theme of stealing time. And one of the things that was really powerful in the example that you gave us of, I think it was someone trying to read at night, laying down, fearful of the reprisals of the employer. That sense of, virtually having no free time, and having to steal back time for her own, for her own intellectual stimulation and her own creative work. And so that theme of appropriation and that theme of taking back, it seems to me is a very important one, and it's related to a different kind of theme, which was raised, Antje, in one way by your presentation, which is the question of whether, whether these representations need to always be mindful of the ways in which they might offend, right? I mean, so this raises obviously an important kind of political question in specific contexts for specific purposes. But Elyas, in your presentation, I was very struck, particularly with the performance with the bonfire, because, and I wanted to ask you more about that, because there seems to be a kind of, in your performance, there seemed to be a kind of cultivated, almost vindictiveness that was being performed when you were snatching people's homes away from them and then very casually tossing them in the fire. And so, I mean, one set of questions revolves around, did people know what to expect? Was that part of, sort of the purpose of the performance, to kind of instigate a situation where people would have to reflect on that loss, even though it was only a symbolic one. But that sort of, that act of physically appropriating people's cardboard homes off of their own bodies and then tossing it in the fire, seems very powerful to me. But it raises this question in a different way about the subjectivity of migrants and refugees in a context of appropriating and taking back that that can also be a provocation and controversial.
Well, just to kind of answer your question about the performance, no, the audience, they didn't know what's going to happen, and in most of my performances I try to somehow
involve audience. Basically, they are part of the they're making the performance themselves, and so it will be totally different. For example, when I did that performance of asking audience to give a bit of their blood, I didn't know how many people would do that, how many people scared of needles, for example. And there was about 21 people gave their blood, and out of maybe 150. Or in the other case of those people who made those cardboard houses, some of them they did that, and some of them they didn't have time or they didn't want to do. And some of them they did with so much passion, like I asked them to just think of their childhood memories and the house that they like or the house that they dream and they want to have. So they kind of made it with so much passion. And then they kind of, it was quite unexpected for them, and we didn't tell to anyone, even to volunteers, that what's going to happen. That first it's a very small fire at the corner, and as if it's going to be for something else, not for that. And that was, I did felt, for example, a few people, they took their homes off their head, so they didn't want to. And so I take that and that house. But for me it was like to show that how one person can have that authority to come and take your house, and very randomly as well. So you don't know who's going to be the next person, and maybe your house is safe as it happens, for example, in Palestine, and you don't know if tomorrow your house is there or not, or the bombardment in Afghanistan by the US force. You don't know if it's going to be a survive or not. Yeah. Thank you.
I think it is that's one of the main things that we observe during Kunchi's research residency. I mean, thinking about just looking at how these migrant workers hang out, and then in Victoria Park, and all doing all sorts of things, what they can do in their day off, because it's usually Sunday, and then thinking about writing as something that is productive, but also thinking about the meaning of working, working to survive, working to feed other people, and then the idea of working as something that forced them to be, like constantly on the move, and like a cycle really. And so that's how we came up with the idea of reading, trying to play around with the idea of non-productive time, and the idea of reading as a way to imagine different types of subjectivity, maybe. And in other Kunchi's project as well, we actually seems to be, cannot run away from this tension between time and working, and the idea of time, working, and then the precarity to emerge from that. And I think that is something that we attempt to capture, basically, from that. This maybe if there is something that very typical precariousness, so maybe the text speaks for itself. This is the kind of
Rekarti that they want to say, like they want to revise their own story, basically.
Maybe if I can say a few more things about the art to not provoke and why we intentionally chose that. It was really important for us to not come across as these kind of top-down lecturing people what to do. I mean, this is often a tone which is chosen, for example, by the Australian government when they come up with these demands of what transit countries or any countries in the region ought to be doing to help them with the externalized border protection. So by choosing a different approach, by acknowledging what there is, yet also not ignoring things that go wrong, we were hoping that people would be more open to the message that we were trying to sneak in. And I think on a symbolic level, and it's not necessarily spelled out in the movie, the aim was to kind of blend the refugees into the Indonesian hosts. For example, when you see these scenes where they're all playing soccer together, they're wearing the same kind of shirts that, unless you go up very closely, you can't even see which one is a Hazara, which one is like an Indonesian player. And some of these messages might only come across to maybe an Indonesian audience, like these guys, before they enter the soccer ground, they do this little prayer. And that, I think, to an Indonesian audience is fully understood as like they follow these tiny rituals that our own soccer players would do. And thereby it's really trying to erase as many differences or borders in between these people. And again, it's even with the kind of music that we play in the background, it's kind of being as smooth as possible to sneak in our message.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Elyas Alavi. And my question is about, like, I want to, besides your work, I want to understand your point of view that when you mentioned the words hometown, second home, and also after the talk that you had and the woman here had about the freedom after leaving and also the hardship that you were mentioning, how do you, and in relation with nationality, how do you define Afghanistan and Iran for yourself now that, because anyway, there are some locations and they have some meanings that they made you come back to them and make some artwork. So what is their definition for you?
Yeah, I mean, well, before going back to the village I was born, I was always thought that I belonged to there and I belonged to a country called Afghanistan, and it was so important for me. I think after that it kind of changed in some ways, because I felt, as I said, like I found that place, and I think it made it so much easier for me to feel like I'm also from Australia. Before, I thought like people when I walk in the streets in Adelaide, they are different. I'm a stranger coming to this city, and I don't know them. They look at me differently maybe. But once I back after that trip, which I think it was a more also like an internal journey as well. I felt I know these people and they don't look at me differently, and I think just the idea of nationality as such is not important for me. But for example, I do know if I went to Kurdistan in Iraq, for example, as so many people know Rumi, like Maulana Balkhi, and Ibn Sina, and so many like Hafiz or other writers, and they could be born in Afghanistan today, or they could be born in Iran today, but basically. I know that we do share exactly the same history and the same language. So I don't feel like, especially between Iran and Afghanistan, like saying, "Oh, there is my country." Of course, like I have, because what's happening in Afghanistan is just so, it's just so horrible, really, to witness, and having family members there. I do really follow more about what's happening there, but just that the idea of nationality on that sense of being proud of I'm from Afghanistan and not, say, for example, I have nothing with Iran. It definitely is not important for me, and even in general, like exactly where I'm having the Australian passport, which I travel with, but it doesn't mean that feeling that if I'm coming to Europe and live there, here could be my home as well. I'm not sure if
Okay, I see. Oh, one more question. I think we'll make that the last question. So.
Thank you. Yeah, well, Elyas Alavi, as I post your poems, when you're reading poems, in my page, there's lots of other poets from other countries writing and say hi to you. And you are the first, I just told you that, you're one of the first, maybe the first modernist poets from Afghanistan in Iran. There's influenced lots of other people, young people in your age or my age. And you already introduced another level or another generation from Afghan to Iran. And there's a question comes from all of you. You just told us that this generation, when it comes, how they influenced and changed after a few years. Some of them were 16, they are 26. So as I go back to art, when we produce the art, we have influence on the art, and the art has influence on us. Say, my question is that how much could change the society in your countries?
Big question.
I really love to hear from all of you.
Okay. It won't change, but 10 years ago I did a film, a very strong film about Libya and Italian relation on immigration, and also on my own stories and stories about sufferers. But the present situation that shows you that you cannot change the society. The film has gone every place in Italy and also in Europe, but it remains the same. But I think what it changed is the daily life among people. But the political issue that you are talking about is hard to change it with an action, an artistic production. But you can change the individuals who can be fruitful or useful in the future to help them live a calm life or without being biased by other information. So you are helping in the meantime to change people who are exposed to see. Not everybody can see it, but those who are exposed are being helped in some way to understand a lot of point of view. So you might not change the political situation, but you can change the single individuals as the youngsters who grow up and can make also change in the future by their own.
I have no answer. I don't know if I can change anything. Here, you mean in Sweden?
Yeah, because in Sweden we have this conversation of how people changed after 2015 when this migration started in Sweden. But lots of people, and I'm afraid nowadays a lot from people like me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And like
I think your question is wrong person. I'm wrong person to say about changes because I have been working before us. You know, I wrote for Swedish magazine and newspapers. I work with policymakers still. I have meeting 4 times with leading group of migration board in Sweden, and I change nothing. Nobody listened. They are not interested. Yeah, so I'm sorry. Yeah, change is not coming from academics or university. Change coming from outside. You know, the real change comes from this street. Yeah, not from university.
Yeah. Thank you.
Very much, I agree, but I do think things are changing. Whether I have contributed to this or not, I think it's hard to say. One development that I find very positive in Indonesia is that when I started looking at refugee issues there, I didn't have many people to talk to. What I found, like in my interviews, and I couldn't really share my observations. I remember the first talk I ever gave in Indonesia. There were 3 people who came along to listen, and one of them was actually my research assistant. So nowadays there's definitely more interest, and it's very much in the hands of young Indonesians, for example, who are taking up research topics and write PhDs about migration-related topics. And for me, this is actually very good to see. So it doesn't require the white person to come in and sneak around and tell people what I have found. But basically, Indonesians can do this themselves, and they often do this in collaboration with refugees themselves. There's a very positive development, for example, in terms of education. So refugees in Indonesia are not allowed to go to school. So basically, refugees would just set up their own schools. So there is a lot of change. It probably would have happened anyway, but well, I'm glad that I got to write about it, I say.
Well, personally as an artist, I do feel I always ask that questions, like what I can change with my art, and even why I make art, and even that question as you raised, like how even I'm on that position to make art about the refugees, because my position is quite different now. I'm safe and I have Australian passport, and it's very challenging, but. Like even when the times are happening, as you know, every week, horrible attacks happening in Afghanistan, and then I'm like, oh, shall I write a poem or even make artwork? But when I see, for example, in walls in Syria, and there are poems of Nazar Qabani written by ordinary people, just like very ordinary handwriting, and it's just I think it just kind of gives me that inspiration that you don't need to do like a big thing, you know. You just need to do what you're good at and what you think is right. So even it could be that line or that painting. I mean, I do feel like art. No, I mean, artist doesn't have that responsibility really to change anything. But I do believe it does like the collective work. It does really bring changes, and at least for some individuals. And yeah, thank you.
I think there are a lot of ways, well, maybe not a lot, but some ways to answer your question, especially within Indonesian context. And of course, there are other ways to, deal with migrant workers. But I guess the way we are doing it in Kunci is that we are trying to defend their works as intellectual works, because oftentimes they are also stigmatized, as just, manual workers, labor, and they also having humiliations, feeling humiliated because they just laborers, as if they don't have rights to express their own intellectuality. And many people also just frame their stories as just sad stories, and that's it. So that is one. And in the long run, I think now I really believe that what one thing that we need in Indonesia is a condition where we can nurture this kind of disobedience. I think that's really important and essential, especially in, I'm talking about people like in my generation, that now I'm feeling very privileged to experience firsthand Reformation in 1998. So that becomes, now I'm feeling that that's become certain memories that later become developed into my own archives, and later transform and informs many practices that I do, be it in Kunci or with my personal works. And it's a kind of privilege because the collective vision that supposed to happen after Reformasi seems to be constantly refracted and or maybe forgotten for generation who maybe born in 1990s. They don't know what happened in 1998, and that's just only 20 years ago. So that's become histories and then becomes privilege, and that's why I can say that maybe this is also the case not only in Indonesia but also in other contexts as well, that disobedience is something like an attitude that we really need, not necessarily to change everything, but we've got to have that kind of attitude.
Okay, thank you for coming, and thank you to all the speakers today for wonderful presentations. Last round of applause.